Epilogue, third generation. Jetboy dove out of the sky in his rocket-sleek plane, speed lines roaring off the swept-back wings. 20mm cannons barked ragged calligraphy, and the Tyrannosaur staggered as the shells tore into him. "Arnie, Arnie, turn out that light." "Yes, Mother," Arnie said. He slid the 54-page special Jetboy on Dinosaur Island back into its plastic bag. He switched off his reading light and carried the comic across the familiar darkness of his bedroom and put it away in the closet. He had a complete run of Jetboy comics in one of the waxed cardboard boxes they used to ship chickens to grocery stores. On the shelf above it were stacked scrapbooks full of clippings about the great and powerful Turtle and the Howler and Jumpin' Jack Flash. And next to them stood the dinosaur books, not just the kids' stuff with the crude drawings, but textbooks on paleontology and botany and zoology. Hidden in the back of another box of comics was the Playboy that had Peregrine in it. Lately, looking at those pictures had made Arnie feel strange, kind of nervous and excited and guilty all at the same time. His parents knew about his obsessions, all but the Playboy anyway. It was only the wild card business that bothered them. Arnie's grandfather had been on the street that day, had seen it with his own eyes when Jetboy exploded into history. A year later, Arnie's mother had been born with low-grade telekinesis, just enough to move a coin a few inches across a plastic tablecloth. Sometimes Arnie wished she'd just been normal, better that than to get a power that wasn't good for anything. He'd made his grandfather tell him about it over and over again. He wanted to die, the old man would say. He saw the future, and he wasn't in it, just wasn't any place for him anymore. "Hush, Grandpa," Arnie's mother would say. "Don't talk that way in front of Arnie." Arnie crept quietly back to bed and lay on his stomach, pleasantly aware of the pressure on his groin. He thought about Dinosaur Island. There was no question in his mind that it was real. Aces were real. Aliens were real. They had brought the wild card to Earth. He turned on his side and pulled his knees up towards his chest. What would it be like? When he was 8, he'd driven through Utah with his parents, and he'd made them stop at Vernal. They'd gone on the prehistoric nature trail, and Arnie had run ahead to be by himself with the life-size dinosaur models. Dinosaur Island would look like that, he thought, the rugged brush-covered hills in the background, the Diplodocus big enough that he could walk under its belly, the Struthiomimus like a huge scaly ostrich, the Pteranodon crouched like it had just glided in for a landing. His eyes closed and he could see them moving now, not just the crummy dinosaurs you could see on TV, but the special ones, the tiny vicious Deinonychus, the terrible Claw, or the hideous lumpy Ankylosaur, a 35-foot horned toad with a club on its tail that could dent steel plate. And deep in his brain, inflamed by the rich, yeasty endocrine soup in which it floated, the wild card virus hovered over a cell, paused, then pumped out its alien message and died. And so, on and on it went, spiraling down through the years in a double helix of fear and ecstasy, mutation and miraculous change. Appendix: The Science of the Wild Card Virus. Excerpts from the literature. Fearful beyond imagining, worse in many ways to what we saw in Belsen. 9 out of 10 affected by this unknown pathogen die horribly. No treatment helps. The survivors aren't a lot more lucky. None out of 10 of them are somehow transformed by a process I can't even begin to understand, into something else. Sometimes not even remotely human. I've seen men turn into effigies of galvanized rubber, children sprouting extra heads. I can't go on, and what's worst is, they're still alive. Still alive, Mac. Strangest of all, maybe, are the 10% of survivors, the 1 in 100 of those who actually contract the sickness. They don't show any outward sign of change, mostly, but they have, I have to call them powers. They can do things a normal human can't. I've seen a man soaring in the sky like a V2, looping the loop and returning to land lightly on his feet. A berserk patient tearing a heavy steel gurney apart as if it was tissue paper. Not 10 minutes ago, a woman walked through the wall of the little office of this one-time warehouse where I've shut myself away for a few minutes' respite. A naked woman, gorgeous, a real pin-up type, glowing with a rosy light that seemed to come from inside her body, smiling a fixed glassy smile. I'm not cracking up, Mac. I haven't gone around the bend into madness or morphine, not yet, even if I'm lucky to get an hour or 2 of sleep a night. And then the horror fills my dreams, so I'm almost glad to crawl out of my cot and face the reality of what's happened here. These things are happening. They're real. You may read about it yourself one someday. If the brass don't succeed in clamping the lid down, I don't see how they can. This is Manhattan, for Christ's sake, and the victims number tens of thousands. Thank God it's not catching. Thank God for that. As far as we can see, it only develops in those directly exposed to the dust, or whatever it was, and not in all of them, or we'd have a million more. As it is, quarantine is impossible, even adequate sanitation. We've had an outbreak of influenza in our wards, expecting typhus any hour. They say some kind of aliens are behind it all, men from outer space. Given what we've all seen, that doesn't sound far-fetched. I've heard it noised around at the highest levels that they've even caught one. I hope it's true. Then they can stick the bastard in the docket with the Nazi bosses at Nuremberg and hang him like the animal he is. Personal letter from Captain Kevin McCarthy, United States Army Medical Corps, September 21st, 1946. Accounts of the incident make it clear that the vessel containing xenovirus Tachys A exploded at an altitude of 30,000 feet, well within the so-called jet stream. In its dormant state, the virus is encased in a durable protein sheath, the spores, so often and incorrectly referred to in the lay press, which experiment has shown to be resistant to extremes of temperature and pressure, such as to permit its survival under natural conditions from several hundred feet beneath the ocean to the upper limits of the stratosphere. Viral particles were borne eastward across the Atlantic on the jet stream, washing out at random intervals by droplets of rain or settling naturally. The precise mechanisms still await demonstration or observation. This accounts for the mid-Atlantic Queen Mary tragedy, September 17, 1946, as well as the subsequent outbreaks in England and on the continent. Note, rumors persist of a large outbreak in the USSR, but Premier Khrushchev's regime continues to maintain a silence as absolute as its predecessors on the matter. Wind and ocean currents provided short-term dispersal of the virus over a substantial area of the eastern United States and southern Canada. The location of the majority of major international outbreaks provides a clue as to the possible pattern. Rio de Janeiro, 1947. Mombasa, 1948. Port Said, 1948. Hong Kong, 1949. Auckland, 1950. To name a few of the most notorious all major seaports. The problem was how to account for the appearances of the virus, generally in isolated incidents, in locations as far from the sea as the Peruvian Andes and remote uplands of Nepal. As our investigation reveals, the answer clearly lies in the durability of the protein coat. The virus can be carried by any means, human, mechanical, animal, or natural, and survives indefinitely unless exposed to destructive agents such as fire or corrosive chemicals. The majority of North American outbreaks and the relatively large occurrences in seaports have been pervasively traced, McCarthy, Report to the Surgeon General, 1951, to items awaiting shipment in the docks and warehouses of the affected district of Manhattan. Others have been attributed to the precipitation of viral particles onto vessels and vehicles in transit. Individuals, even birds and animals, who are never affected, can carry the particles on their person without knowing it. The Nepalese outbreak referred to the above, for example, was traced to Naik of the Gurung clan, whose regiment, the King's Gurkha Rifles, was involved in attempting to contain the ghastly communal violence of August 10th through the 13th in Calcutta, India, in which the Hindu and Muslim communities blamed one another for an outbreak of the virus, with a resulting loss of life estimated at 25,000. The Gurkha corporal himself never developed the disease. How many deposits of dormant virus remain, dusted across rooftops, gathered in sediment in the rivers and sewers, lying in deposits in the soil, still borne aloft on the jet stream, cannot be determined. How serious a threat it still poses to the public health is still equally unascertainable. In this context, the inability of the virus to affect the vast majority of the populace should be borne in mind. Goldberg and Hoyne, the wild card virus, persistence and dispersal. Problems in Modern Biochemistry, Schinner, Pike, and Ozawa, editors. The ability of the wildcard virus to alter its host's genetic programming resembles that of terrestrial herpes viruses. It is, however, much more comprehensive, altering DNA throughout the host's body, rather than affecting and being expressed in a certain location. Example, the lips or genitalia. As are the herpes family, we know now that xenovirus Tachys A affects a larger percentage of an exposed population than originally assumed, perhaps as much as 0.5%. In many cases, the virus merely appends its own code to the host DNA. This is the dormant form in which the virus has no objective existence, but exists only in the form of information. Another trait it shares with the herpes form viruses. It may remain passive and undetected indefinitely, or some trauma or stress to the host may cause it to express itself, generally with shattering results. Amounting as it does to reprogramming of the host's genetic code, the virus, in either active or passive form, is truly inheritable, like blue eyes or curly hair. Apparently anticipating its predominantly lethal effects, the Takesian scientists who created the virus designed it to perpetuate itself as, in effect, a recessive wild card gene, recessive, because a dominate gene that produced lethal mutations in 90% of offspring and rendered another 9% either unable or unlikely to reproduce would survive only a few generations, even if, as is estimated, 30% of all those with xenovirus-modified DNA carry a dormant form. The wild card therefore follows the conventional rules of inheritance for recessive traits. Only in cases where both parents carry the viral code does any possibility of producing an affected offspring exists. Even then, the chance is only 1 in 4, versus a 50% chance of producing a carrier with no chance of expressing the virus, and another 1 in 4 chance an offspring who does not carry the code. Marcus A. Meadows, Genetics, January 1947. Despite the red-baiting paranoia of the late 1940s and early 1950s and the findings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, ACEs fared no better behind the Iron Curtain than in this country, and in fact, considerably worse. The party line was laid down Trofim D. Lysenko, semi-literate maven of Stalinist science, that the supposedly alien wild card was merely a mask for diabolical bourgeois, capitalist, imperialist experimentation. In Korea, captured Americans were made to sign confessions of germ warfare in an apparent attempt to account for the outbreak of the virus that swept the nation, north and south, in 1951. Meanwhile, anyone showing signs of metahuman talents within the Soviet sphere simply disappeared, some to forced labor camps, others to labs, and no few to shallow graves. With Stalin's death in 1953 came a minor relaxation. Khrushchev acknowledged the existence of ACEs, and they began to enjoy the status they had in the U.S., i.e., they had the privilege of serving in the military or GPU, later KGB, or vanishing into the Gulag archipelago. As the 1960s passed, strictures against them relaxed, if not to the extent that they did in the United States, and state-sponsored superheroes were permitted to become media personalities, like cosmonauts and Olympic stars. Why the initial rejection of blatant reality? The Brezhnev-Kosygin regime admitted in 1971 that Lysenko was a joker in whom the virus was expressed as hideous disfigurement. The existence of ACEs was a personal affront to the former farmer. As to why Stalin went along with the anti-ACE campaign, the rampant paranoia of the dictator's later years in particular is generally considered sufficient explanation. However, several highly placed defectors of the late 1960s and early 70s repeated the rumor that Comrade Nikita sometime, late at night in his cups with boon companions, boasted that he himself had slain the former dictator with his own hand in the cellar of the Lubyanka prison, driving a stake through his heart. J. Neil Wilson, Back in the USSR. Reason, March 1977. Xenovirus Tachus A, colloquially called wildcard, was an experimental organic device developed by the Ilkazam, a leading family among the Psi lords of Tachus. Written into its DNA is a program that reads the genetic code of the host organism and modifies that code in order to enhance the host's innate propensities and characteristics. Such an optimization gratifies as never before the great Takesian drive to cultivate personal, and by extension, familial, virtue. Takesians already possess potent mental powers, by means of wild talents in its members, ensuring its preeminence for many years to come. The challenge the Ilkazam researchers faced was to produce a program that would identify and enhance desirable characteristics. No one wants to be a better hemophiliac. Biochemical individuality among Takesians, however, is even more marked than in humans, who are one of the most biochemically diverse species on Terra. To develop software capable of discerning favorable characteristics, an intelligent program, and enhancing them, and which could be implemented in the viral DNA, required experimentation on an extravagant scale. Given the nature of Tahitian society, there were always plenty of subjects available for even the most drastic experiments, Tahitians as a whole not having many hang-ups about insisting the subjects volunteer. However, even Takis lacked a sufficiently large supply of criminals and vanquished political enemies, not a distinction commonly drawn in that culture, to provide the sort of experimental base needed to fully develop such a complex tool. Fortunately, from the Tahitian point of view, a pool of creatures of astonishingly similar genetic makeup presented itself: Earth. Most wildcard enhancements aren't favorable to survival, or are survival traits taken to lethal lengths, such as keying the adrenaline fight or flight system so high that the slightest stress forces the victim into overdrive, burning him out in a single burst of terminal speed trip frenzy. 9 out of 10 survivors had undesirable characteristics enhanced, or desirable ones enhanced in undesirable ways. The Joker takes forms ranging from hideous through the painful to the pathetic, or simply inconvenient. A victim might be reduced to a formless blob of mucus, like the familiar Jokertown resident Snotman, or might be transformed into a partial animal likeness, like tavern keeper Ernie the Lizard. He might acquire a power that, in other circumstances, would make him an ace, such as the limited but uncontrollable levitation of the floater. The manifestation may be quite minor, like the mass of tentacles that form the right hand of Joker's Wild, Jokertown's decadent poet laureate. In certain cases, the distinction between classifications is blurred, as in the aforementioned Ernie, whose slightly greater than human strength and the protection offered by his scaly hide are sufficient to make him a true ace. Another, more horrific example is the tragic Burning Woman incident in the late 70s, in which the virus affected a young woman by causing her body to burn with an inextinguishable flame, but to regenerate itself even as her flesh was consumed. The victim begged passerby to kill her, and finally died in Jokertown's Blythe Van Rensselaer Memorial Clinic, apparently as a result of euthanasia. A resulting indictment against Dr. Tachyon was quashed. Whether her card qualified as Joker or Black Queen cannot be determined. Because it is designed to interact with the host's individual code, no two expressions of wildcard are alike. Moreover, its behavior differs from subject to subject. That, as many as 10% of those who contracted the virus survived its side effects, is a tribute to the skill of Tahitian genetic software and hardware artistes. For a first large-scale test among a subject population different than that for which it was originally designed, the release of the virus on Terra was a tremendous success, which would greatly have pleased its creators had they learned of its outcome. Earth, on the other hand, had a different point of view. Sarah Morgenstern, Blues for Jokertown, 40 Years of Wild Cards. Rolling Stones, September 16, 1986. Excerpts from the Minutes of the American Metabiological Society Conference on Metahuman Abilities, Clarion Hotel, Albuquerque, New Mexico, March 14 to 17, 1987. Talk presented March 16, 1987, by Dr. Sharon Pao-Kiang Shi of the Harvard University Department of Metabiophysics. Gentle persons of the society, I thank you. I shall come directly to the point. Research by our team at Harvard indicates that metahuman abilities, the colloquially called superpowers, engendered by the Tahitian wildcard virus, are exclusively of psychic origin, and in all but rare cases are exercised through the instrumentality of psionics. Session called to order by Chairperson Ozawa. I understand that my preceding statement might be considered a rhetorical excess of the kind perpetrated by certain of my predecessors, which caused the still fledgling field of metabiophysics to be considered a pseudoscience of the caliber of numerology and astrology by a number of serious scientists. Yet honesty and the press of empirical evidence compel me to reiterate, metahuman abilities are specialized forms of psychic power. We now have a better idea of just what the wild card did to its victims. In so-called ACE cases, the virus appears to have acted first by enhancing innate physical ability, which gave direction to the overall progress of the gene code rewrite. This explains the high degree of correspondence between the personalities and proclivities of known ACEs and their metahuman abilities. Why, for example, devoted pilots such as Black Eagle acquired powers including that of flight, why the obsessed Avenger of the Night, Black Shadow, has such control over darkness, why the reclusive Aquarius presents a half-human, half-delphin appearance, and can in fact transform himself into a sort of super Tertsiops. A microscale telekinesis appears to be one of the mechanisms by which wildcard affects its changes, enabling the subject subconsciously to choose, or at least influence, the nature of the transformation she or he undergoes. I understand the enormity of the implication that people might, in some sense, have chosen to draw a Joker or Black Queen. Speculation in that direction is, however, beyond the scope of our present researches. One of the great puzzles of the post-wildcard epoch has been precisely how the alien virus, however advanced the technology that produced it, was able to give certain individuals the ability to violate well-established natural laws, such as conservation of mass and energy, the square cube law, the inviolability of the speed of light itself. At the time the virus was unleashed, science was inalterably hostile to the existence of even psychic powers, justifiably, given the lack of compelling experimental corroboration for such phenomena. It has now been compelled to accept people being able to project fire and lightning, to transform themselves into animals, to fly, or contrive mechanical appliances that enabled them to do these and similar things in flagrant disregard for principles of mechanics and engineering. Of course, even by 1946, clues were available in the theoretical reaches of quantum physics. In fact, then modern technology, up to and including nuclear weapons and the fusion devices in the process of development, was largely based upon quantum mechanics, much of the work being done on the basis of, we know it works, but we don't know how. Given the impetus of the reality of wildcard, psionic powers were quickly given a quantum mechanical rationale, action over distance without apparent recourse to the strong, electroweak, or gravitic forces being a feature. For example, the curious interconnectedness of particles that have interacted, postulated by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen in their famous paradox, and established with some finality by the aspect experiment in France in 1982. A fairly obvious instance of TK-based power is shape-changing. The subject, in almost all cases, subconsciously rearranges her or his component atoms to produce a gross structure that differs considerably from its original. For example, Elephant Girl's rather unsettling transformation into a flying Elephas Maximus, in apparent violation of the mass-energy conversion principle. At least in the case of Elephant Girl, this is explained by subconscious TK on the subatomic level. Miss O'Reilly can apparently summon into being a cloud of virtual particles, and maintain them in existence immensely longer than they would normally exist. A discussion of virtual particles is, of course, likewise beyond the scope of this presentation. I refer the interested to articles concerning, for example, the particles that carry the strong interaction, and that for an infinitesimal instant violate the conservation principle. As part of restoring herself to her original appearance, Miss O'Reilly permits the virtual particles that made up the phantom mass to lapse into non-existence. It was Elephant Girl's ability to fly in defiance of all known aeronautical principles that sparked the line of inquiry leading to the conclusions expressed in this paper. Simply put, Elephant Girl's, Peregrine's, and all known aces, flight or levitation, is simply a variation on TK. In this sense, the great and powerful turtle is the archetypical flying ace, in that he acknowledgedly flies by means of his telekinetic ability, but no trick of psychics would permit Elephant Girl's ears, or even Peregrine's magnificent wings, to uphold even a small human in flight, to say nothing of a full-grown Asiatic elephant. They, like the turtle, fly through use of mind power alone. Energy projections provide another thorny problem simply explained by, again, TK. Jumpin' Jack Flash appears to project blasts of flame from the palms of his hands, and moreover can manipulate the fire he produces in remarkable ways. But this individual does not actually project the flame, in a sense that it is not emitted from his own body. In point of fact, it isn't strictly speaking flame. His TK enables him to regulate the Brownian motion of circumambient air. He creates a hotspot of highly excited particles, approximately 1 micron from the flesh of his palm, and then uses TK to direct the resultant stream of incandescent gas. Superluminal flight powers present a special case. In most cases, and it's beneficial to keep in mind that each wildcard transformation is unique, the individual with the capacity for light speed or faster-than-light travel has the ability to emulate a single photon, or tachyon in the latter instance, becoming a macrophoton in a manner similar to the macroatom devices University of Sussex researchers under Terry Clark, which can emulate the behavior of a single boson. The spaceship that conveyed the wildcard virus to this planet, as well as the humanoid alien known as Dr. Tachyon, employed the same principle for their superluminal drive, which led to the coining of the word by which the only Earth resident not born on this planet is known to this day. Faster-than-light travel has proven of only limited utility to ACEs to date, owing to limits of duration and problems of navigation over long distances, so far insuperable to our technology, or so we infer from the fact that no ACE has ever journeyed beyond the limits of the solar system, present orbit of Neptune, and returned. A salient feature of the so-called gadgets, anti-gravity belts, dimensional portals, armored suits, is in fact that none of them can be replicated. On disassembly and examination, they're often found to make no mechanical or electrical sense. Each is a non-reproducible result. This explains why some enterprising gadget master hasn't marketed, say, a personal light-speed flying belt or an anti-gravity forklift. Only the creator could make one that would work. In some cases, the components consist of ludicrous assemblages of debris, up to and including apple cores, hairpins, and the torsos of Barbie dolls. Others consist of only a diagram of a circuit, which, like the chimerical Hieronymus machine, work as an actual circuit should. The explanation is, once again, a manifestation of psychic ability. The creator has in effect impressed himself upon his work in a metaphysical, in the current scientific meaning, sense. This explanation makes sense of the frequently observed phenomenon that there seems to be a limit to certain gadget masters' creativity, that they will sometimes have to disassemble an old device to get a new one to work. This explanation also makes it simple to predict that attempts by governments all over the world to replicate the astounding modular man android are doomed to failure unless one or more contract the services of wild talents of their own. A feature of almost all ACEs is a higher energy metabolism than normal humans possess. Some seem able to summon up the energy to fuel their abilities from within themselves, or, for want of a better way of putting it, from the cosmos. Others either need external sources of energy to power their talents, or find themselves aided by the availability of such sources. The black strongman known as the Harlem Hammer, for example, finds it necessary to consume a substantial amount of heavy metal salts in his diet to maintain the high-level reactions of his metabolism, as well as a number of bone seekers, such as strontium-90 and barium-140, which seem to be replacing the calcium in his bones, giving them greater than normal durability and strength. Jumpin' Jack Flash draws strength and sustenance from exposure to fire and heat. Others derive their extra-human energy from batteries, which generally prove to be of the same genus as the Hieronymus-type devices. Whatever the source of this energy, no ace has yet been discovered who could not exhaust her or his supply in a reasonably short time by intensive exertion of metahuman abilities. Some can recharge simply by resting for a time. Others actually require an external power supply. Again, each case is unique. Further confirmation of the psychic hypothesis comes from the case of the so-called sleeper, who possesses a different set of meta-abilities every time he awakens from sleep. Any other model for the function of ace powers would have difficulty accounting for this phenomenon. My colleagues and I are willing, in sum, to go so far as to say that psionics can account for all observed ace abilities, and that no other explanation can.